fishing, it's in my soul.
Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
Hello, Salt Strong Nation. Joe Simons. Like diamonds, we are back. Got my boy Wyatt Parcell. What's up, Wyatt?
What's going on, Joe? I'm excited to be here today.
Dude, we got some big news that we're going to talk about in a second with Mr. Wyatt. He is going to be moving to a brand new state, which kind of the topic of this podcast, which how to catch a speckled trout in any state. Obviously, they're not in all 50 states, but we're going to talk about the states that you can catch speckled trout, starting in Texas, go over to Florida, and obviously we'll cover the whole Gulf Coast, all the way up really to Virginia. And if you guys don't know Wyatt, he's one of our fishing coaches here at Salt Strong, currently lives in North Carolina. And as I teased earlier, will be moving soon to a brand new state, and it's not Florida, just to apply these same principles that he not only has learned partially from the Insider Club, but now has gone out as a full-time fishing coach and putting the same type of techniques to the test out on the water, creating reports every week for our members, coaching our members. And you did it in a brand new state there, North Carolina, not knowing anything about the waters, right? I mean, you never really done any fishing there at the time?
Yeah. So prior to me being employed by Salt Strong, I'd only ever fished in Florida, and I fished a lot around the Panhandle. So I was used to kind of murkier waters. So that wasn't too terribly new to me, but man, the tide swings that we have here in North Carolina, the winding marshes, it was a completely new fishing environment. And prior to that, I had never put a line in the water in North Carolina. So yeah, everything that I have done here the past, year and a half has been completely through Salt Strong's learning, and all the courses and tips that we offer. And I mean, it's all paid off. And now I'm consistently catching fish, going from that Panhandle area where I was having a little bit of success to now I'm completely new zone. And it's just revolutionary, all the stuff that I've learned from the Insider Club. And
a lot of you might be thinking, oh, he must have some crazy fancy boat and all this fancy equipment. So when he moved to North Carolina, he didn't even have a kayak, or maybe you did. It was a really cheap one that barely floated. And so you're fishing from foot. I mean, you had to get on satellite maps and go through these mastery courses and watch our weekend game plans to figure out where the fish would be from foot. Now you have a kayak, but still to date, no boat, right? Like all the fish that everyone sees you catch, it's all kayak or wade fishing.
Yeah, it's all been on foot, and it's all been in a kayak. That first kayak I had, I got it on Facebook Marketplace, I think for like $250. It was a little Pelican. Now I'm in the Old Town that Luke has lent me, and that thing's a beast. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that later, how different kayaks can probably help you catch more trout or maybe adversely affect your trout fishing. But yeah, wade fishing and kayak fishing only.
Yep. And then we'll also talk about, this is the latest book. I teased it on an earlier podcast. If you guys are watching the video here, you can see how beat up this, and I would love to say I beat this thing up reading it so much, but I didn't. It came this way. I love to buy used books. This is Saltwater Strategies, for those of you listening, by Larry Bosco, famous dude in Texas. All you Texas guys are probably ashamed at me that I'm butchering his name, but the subtitle is How, When, and Where to Fish the Western Gulf Coast. A big chunk of this book is about catching speckled trout, something that our Texas anglers, our Texas Insider members absolutely love. A big chunk of the book is dedicated to wade fishing for big speckled trout and some redfish and flounder, but mostly speckled trout. So I'm going to go through this as well, because this is a good reminder that so much of what we're teaching does apply to Texas, does apply to even Louisiana. I know every Louisiana guys think they're all different. But we fish there once a year and use the same tactics, same lures to catch redfish and speckled trout in Louisiana. And the same as in Florida, and same as in Georgia and the Carolinas where Wyatt is, and same as Virginia. So I'm going to go through some of the cool things I learned on here. I'm going to kick it off with his quote. This is the intro to the book. You can see my pink highlighter here if you guys are watching. And it says, be willing to listen and learn when it comes to fishing. Be opening to questioning your own beliefs and tactics, and be willing to approach things from a different angle, to try something different, if for no other reason than to learn from the experience. And you have to come to grips with the fact that you will never know everything. We talk about that a lot, Wyatt. It's like fishing is like a never-ending puzzle. You're constantly putting those pieces together. And even the best, even the guys and gals who are writing the books and are literally legends in their states, are continuing to learn every single time they go fishing. So I thought that was a great reminder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every time I go out on the water, it seems like I'm learning something, a different way to work a bait, a different type of structure that fish will hold on in certain conditions. There's always something to learn when you go out on the water. So always try and make it a learning experience.
I am going to have some fun with some of my fishing TV host buddies. So on page 127, just so you know, this is not for me because it's a similar quote. It says, this is from Larry, not me. I've never made a fishing trip during which I didn't learn at least one new technique or strategy. That's a whole lot of fun. That's a whole lot of the fun of fishing. Anyone who tells you that he or she knows it all is either a pathological liar or a television fishing show host. I started laughing when I read that, and that's not true. We love our TV host buddies, but I had to laugh. Obviously, he was giving a low blow to someone in there. So let's start where you are, because you fished a lot of states, and we'll talk about where you're going to be moving here. Kind of a new challenge, at least for a year. And this is not just something like moving for a week or two. This is going to be like a year-long challenge at least. And to document the whole thing, which I think is going to be fascinating. Just like we had Pat on recently, who documented his entire year long of topwater of fishing, of only fishing topwaters every single week for an entire year. I'm really pumped to see what happens when you move to this new state. Hint, hint. It might have something to do with this book. Let's start up where you are in the Carolinas. What are some things that are kind of similar to all the states, and maybe some kind of nuances when it comes to catching speckled trout?
Yeah. So first, starting with the similarities, you got to look at the fish itself. You know, as a species, speckled trout are ambush predators. They've got a camouflage pattern on their back that allows them to sit kind of close to the bottom and they ambush from below. Their jaw hinges upward, and they've got kind of streamlined bodies, and they can swim very fast. So we know, number one, they're an ambush predator that kind of holds lower to the bottom. Number two, their bodies allow them to swim really fast and kind of attack from below. So we need to be looking for situations and types of structure where those fish are going to be getting a lot of food that they can ambush, and they're willing to kind of jump out and grab it. So we're not looking for the really shallow zones in North Carolina. We're not going up in the flats that are, you know, maybe a foot or two deep. Typically, that's where we just find redfish. There's not a whole lot of trout that get up there. In fact, I've never actually seen one in less than, 3-4 foot of water. Typically, I've never laid eyes on a trout fishing here in North Carolina. It's all been deep enough to where I have to work that deeper zone with a jig or just some kind of jerk bait or the twitch baits like the mirror lures. Those are all great baits to work those kind of deeper column zones, letting that kind of current move it. But essentially what we're looking for is pinch points that kind of lead off into marshes, creek mouths, any area where the larger body of water that's moving a lot of that current, because here in the Carolinas, we've got really strong tides that are going to displace bait. Anywhere that larger body of water is going to be moving a lot of current through a pinch point, those trout are going to stack up on some sort of structure in that pinch point, be it a point, an oyster bar, just any kind of shelf, quick depth change, things like that they can jump out kind of from a lower position and grab that bait as it's getting whisked around that pinch point with the current. So the trout literally sit with their nose in the current in a creek mouth, at a point, areas like that, and attack that bait. So because of these, really strong tides that we have, I know anglers down in Florida and Texas, as we're going to talk about later on, there's not as strong of tides. So we typically don't see trout, in I guess you do catch some trout in a little bit deeper water there, but it's more common to catch trout up in the shallows as well, on top of the grass beds that are, a foot, 2 foot deep. We don't have any of that here. And because of the larger tide swings, those trout actually have better feeding opportunities in deeper water where that current has moved sediment. And essentially, you've got easier ambush points for those trout. They can sit below and ambush bait through the water column. That's not to say I haven't been fishing in 6 foot of water and had a trout come up and slam my topwater plugs. In fact, that's one of my favorite way to fish for big trout, is to work those creek mouths with those topwater plugs. But yeah, essentially what we're just looking for is pinch points anywhere you've got good depth changes. And I guess the biggest thing I had to learn, I kind of alluded to this earlier, is you need to be able to fish in current. Positioning is so important for trout in the Carolinas. If you're fishing the wrong side of the current, or you're in the wrong area that you're casting to, just because those trout have a sweet spot, be it at a creek mouth or a point or somewhere where that current is kind of creating an eddy, and they don't have to work as hard to sit in the current, but they still have easy access to food that they can jump out and grab, kind of like we talked about with their streamlined bodies, where they make a quick shoot to grab that bait and they go right back to that eddy. So positioning is really important, making sure that you cast your bait and present it to that little sweet spot exactly how it needs to be. Either paddle tail, twitch bait, there's a ton of different lures you can use. The DOA shrimp is a really popular one here as well. But basically all you're doing is fishing current streams and rips in those pinch points for those trout.
Trout are very similar to humans, right? We all want to eat. And end of the day, we're all kind of lazy. Like, we want to do the least amount of effort in general to eat, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be fast food restaurants or restaurants in general. There'd just be all of us hunting and gathering still, doing it the hard way. And that book talks a lot about that. It's like, if you want to catch any kind of fish, redfish, speckled trout, flounder, start thinking, where's the bait that they're trying to go after, right? Think more like the bait versus them. Because if you can find the bait or whatever they're foraging on at that time, you're usually going to find the fish. And then, to your point, it's about the positioning. Like, where are they going to be? All right, great. You found a creek mouth is an obvious one, right? I mean, it's literally just pushing out this bait that can't swim against the current. And it's just like a dinner bell ringing. So knowing that, they're all going to be coming out of some kind of creek mouth at some point. And then you also know that there's going to be certain areas like eddies, or maybe around some structure, down there, a quick little dip that's going to let those trout have the meal literally just getting handed to them without having to work as hard. And so when you put those two things together, regardless if you're in the Carolinas or Florida or Texas, you're going to be, not to say it's going to be easy, but it's going to become a whole lot easier to consistently catch speckled trout. And yeah, there are some nuances. It's interesting though. Is the water that murky? Because I feel like I've seen a couple of drone shots in the Carolinas that you can see the trout, and it's somewhat shallow water. And obviously, it's only certain times of the year that you're going to have that. What's your experience up there in terms of just water clarity? Yeah. So basically in the summer and kind of going into early fall and even kind of late spring, we've got really, really dirty water. That's because of the, warmer temperatures. It allows the algae to bloom. And, it just murks up a lot more. And you got that chocolate water. You've got the kind of dark green water. In the winter and late fall, you've got, and even early spring, you've got really, really clear water. And that's when you have to kind of adjust to more subtle presentations, because trout do hunt visually. They will hunt with their lateral lines, even in murky water. They've got great eyesight. So in that clear water, you do have to adjust your presentations, but I've found that they will still hunt by sight, even in really murky water. So, in fact, I'll give you a great example. That slam shady paddle tail works just as well in clear water as it does in murky water. Those trout are keying in on it visually just because it's got that flash and foil. They're going to pick up on flashes, I find, more in the dirtier water. And they're going to pick up a little bit more on kind of more subtle patterns in the clearer water. So I'm always trying to incorporate some kind of flash and vibration in murky water. Like my mirror lures, I'll make sure that they've got foil on the sides. That broken glass pattern is great. And we've got a similar kind of thing going on with the slam shady, where it's that silver and gold. And every time that lure kicks its tail, there's a nice little bit of flash. And I like to make, rapid jigs up and down, vertical movements there, twitch, pause, that kind of engage that lure to flash a little bit. Same
same thing with the mirror lures. That really helps those fish key in on that bait in dirty water. Clearer water, it's more of you need to get that bait in the right spot, make it easy on the fish because they can definitely see it. And they're not going to chase it down, in the wintertime over long distances because it's very cold. So you need to make sure that you again, we're talking about making sure you're fishing the sweet spot. You need to make sure you put it close to that fish where it's easy for it to feed and give it a nice slow presentation. I'm usually using really light jig heads in the wintertime, light leader. That way that bait, that paddle tail, that mirror lure, whatever it is I'm using, has the most suspension in front of that fish. The longer you can keep it in the strike zone, make it easier for that fish to hit, the more likely it is to strike.
Because they are lazy.
Yeah. And I would also like to say, I guess I kind of skimmed over this a little bit because we did talk about creek mouse and the types of spots. Types of spots you're going to want to be looking for here in the Carolinas, the entrances to flats, the entrances to main channels, or where main channels split off into feeder creeks. Creek mouse is kind of a very wide term to use, but you're basically not looking in the shallow flats. You're looking for all the areas that lead up to those marshes because that's where all the bait is. It's all in the marsh, whether it be shrimp in the wintertime or bait fish in the summertime and the mix in the spring and fall. You're always looking near the marshes. You're not kind of going to be looking anywhere else. I don't typically fish for them in the surf, but I know a lot of guys will fish the surf right around the inlets where there's a lot of bait being brought in, the rock jetties as well. But inshore wise, I'm always finding them close to the marshes, intercoastal channels leading to those areas, all those pinch points we talked about. Just look for those type of zones.
Find the bait source, find the trout. All right, so let's kind of move down. You've kind of covered the Carolinas, which you fished all over the place there. Going down to Florida, because I know that's where you originally kind of cut your teeth. What's different about Florida? You kind of already touched on it. Is there anything else that you do differently besides, and obviously this is seasonal as well. We could probably, do a 5-hour podcast on this if we broke it down by season, but in general, for the angler who wants to get tight lines, and at the end, we'll talk about some things for like these bigger gator trout, because those are a little bit different animal than just going out and catching a bunch of trout, which is what most of us want to do, just getting tight lines. But talk a little bit about Florida experience.
Yeah, so Florida is awesome, and I was down there with Luke recently, and we really got to kind of have this scenario where it was textbook trout on grass flats. And basically what you've got in Florida versus North Carolina is these shallower flats that these trout like to get up on, because there's not in Florida, I would not say that there's these large marshy areas where there's really big tidal swings and the bait's really concentrated on where it's going to be, and trout can kind of, plan their day around the tide swings. So you've got these really kind of lazy tides, and these fish need to be actively searching for bait, and they need to be in areas that bait is likely to congregate. So the areas that we were hitting up in Florida were more the edges of flats where there was a very slight depth change, or an area where there was a raised sandbar and it was actually like a small mangrove island, anywhere on a large grass flat that there was something that came out of the water, essentially, and it attracted, some sort of food for that bait fish to feed on, and therefore the trout were kind of congregating on that area as well, especially the oyster bars. It seemed like any area that we could find oyster bars close to grass, there was always trout nearby. And it was really interesting to see how shallow those trout get in Florida. I talked about how I don't ever see trout in less than 4 feet of water. I caught my personal best speckled trout in Florida it was probably a 2.5 foot grass flat with Luke. And we were using Topwaters. It was a type of fishing that I'm not used to for trout. Essentially what you're trying to do down there in Florida is you're really trying to fan out and look for probable areas. So we talked about the sweet spot in those high current pinch points in North Carolina. In Florida, you're looking for high probability feeding zones. So some type of mangrove island in the middle of a flat, potholes in the middle of flats. It was, these trout are actively moving around and searching for bait. And it's almost, like what we do. We're hitting up several different spots looking for predator fish. Those predator fish are doing the same thing for bait. Bait might be here one day. The wind might move it to another side of the flat. There's a lot of different variables that are going to move that bait around, but those fish are actively moving around on that grass flat. So it seemed like we were doing a lot more drifting and a lot more, there was less static fishing than I do in North Carolina. I'm going to position up, cast, work that area in the Carolinas. Same thing in South Carolina too. Everything I've talked about here in North Carolina, I've applied it in South Carolina as well. But in Florida, it seemed like we were doing a lot of drifting over the grass flats. It was a lot of run and gun fishing, hitting up these several different spots, very quick cast. The trolling motor was always on. We were always moving, looking for these fish. And then once we found them, it was like bang, 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 bang. You could just get on several trout in these concentrated zones. So I would say the biggest difference, because they still hunt the same way. They're looking for some sort of depth change. They're ambushing from below. They're sitting in that grass. They hunt the same way. The presentations were almost exactly the same. You just had to adjust for a shallower water column, and you were looking for different types of structure.
Yep. And you mentioned the shallow stuff. I want to be clear because this all depends on the time of year. So a couple of Februaries ago, we had our craziest trout day ever. And it happened to be when we had cameras out. And it was a point where basically two kind of different like waterways or channels met, and there's a flat out there, and there's this one big hole. And you wouldn't know it unless you had, some kind of electronics, and we knew it was there. And I'm telling you, there must have been, I wish we could have dropped the camera down to see, but there had to have been 500 trout. I mean, because we've got 85 of them, to the point we just got tired. Like a camera guy is throwing out there. We're literally trying to see what kind of crazy jigs we can put on to get a trout to bite. And all it took was just getting down there, and they were all there. But it made sense when you, back to the point, find the bait or find a place where bait's going to be kind of funneling out. And that was an area where bait's going to be funneling. They had a deeper hole, and it was cold. So they're all down there kind of huddled together, and they could quickly just pop up and grab whatever came over their head. So, and that's what we did. We cast over the hole, and we would just kind of slowly pop stuff down. It didn't even make it to the bottom. The second it got near one of those trout would come up and just absolutely destroy it. And for those of you in Georgia and in Jacksonville, because I know Jacksonville is a little bit different than the part of Florida Wyatt's talking about now, we're kind of throwing that into the Carolinas. I used to live in Georgia many years, even fished there this summer, and we did exactly what Wyatt talks about. I mean, all we did was we found the openings, if you will, these creek mouths to where these marshes, and same in Jacksonville, you got big tide swings, and we literally just sat there. We power pulled down, and we sat there with both mud minnows, shrimp, and slam shady and Alabama leprechauns, and caught trout on all four, just throwing up in these creek mouths and bringing it back slowly and popping off the ground. So I don't want you guys to think we forgot about you. Just trying to kind of put a lot of the stuff into, because they're similar fisheries. At some point, there's not that much difference. And I know some of you might be saying, oh, it's definitely different in my area. But in the day, it's not, because we fished all these places, and you might try things a little bit differently. Like this book says, constantly, be trying different retrievals or maybe even different colors or different sizes. But at the end of the day, most of these trout still kind of behave and think the same way. I mean, end of the day, they want to eat, and they want to spend as little time eating as possible in terms of energy. And they don't want to be killed, so they want to make sure a shark or if they're a small trout, that a bird's not going to come down and get them. Like we were down at the farmhouse. I did that little video you saw of my rod guides were frozen over, and all these little baby bass, which is so cool to see, because years from now they're going to be big bass. And the second my shadow went over these bass, dude, they spooked like crazy. And just because, like, to them, a shadow means a bird. Like, they didn't even see me. Like, I'm pretty far away, just had a long shadow at the time. And it was nuts how fast these fish scatter, because in their mind, a shadow represents, something's going to come down and pull them out of the water, like a big hawk, and take them away. So that's it. I mean, they want to eat, and they want to spend as little energy as possible eating, and they don't want to get killed. And the bigger trout have different predators, obviously, and depending on where you are, could be different saltwater crocodiles and gators and dolphin and all kinds of stuff. But that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, and something you hit on was that anglers might believe that the retrieve would be different depending on where you live. That's one thing I can say I would believe is totally false. Every trout I've seen has virtually the exact same strike zone. It's about a foot above their head. So I want to be clear on one thing. When I touched on earlier that trout kind of sit close to the bottom, you should not be fishing the direct bottom. You should be fishing a little bit kind of, if you were to separate that middle water column, you've got top water, the middle column water in the bottom. I would be fishing kind of that bottom half of the middle column, because those trout are sitting close to the bottom, but you're not going to want to work the very bottom because you're up in their face. It's not natural. The bait's above their head. They're used to striking up and above. And regardless of whether I've been in Florida, the videos that I've seen in Texas, all of the fish that I've caught in the Carolinas, everything I've seen in Georgia and Jacksonville, those trout hit in the exact same pattern. They're not looking for anything sitting on the bottom that's still and static. They're looking for something that's moving kind of above their head. So that's something I can say is a similarity regardless of where you live. And that was a mistake that I made. I was fishing the bottom. I was catching a lot of redfish. I was like, oh, this is the right thing to do. Fish are hitting this bait. And when I was thinking fish, I was, thinking that trout would be included in that as well. You need to change your presentation based on the species you're targeting and how they hunt. So that's something I can say is a similarity between all states as well, is that you should not be fishing the very bottom for trout. It's not to say you won't catch trout, with a gulp shrimp bouncing off the bottom or something like that. But typically they'll hit it right after it comes up the top, right after the bounce, and it'll come right back down. They'll hit it as it's dropping because that's where their strike zone is. That's why those mirror lures work really well. Same thing with paddle tails. You can work at mid column and give it a lot of action. And if you're using a light enough jig head with the paddle tails, or you're using one of the suspending MR17s, I think we've got them in the shop, it just sits right in that column exactly where you want a trout to hit.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's why the paddle tail is, to me, just a no-brainer, especially for anyone who just wants to get a bunch of tight lines. And because once you find them, you cast it out, let it drop for a couple seconds, not all the way to the bottom, and then do a retrieve, do a couple little pops, let it drop, and it's usually on that drop. And we have the underwater footage to show that. I mean, Luke had one recently. I don't know if the footage is out there just yet. We got some really sick underwater footage, but this one trout in the middle water column hit it 3 different times. Just they're coming out and nailing it. And it was all there. Every time a quick little drop, it was going down. They just came in and just ambushed the heck out of that thing. Cool. So, Florida, kind of getting in the panhandle. I know you spent a little time there. Any other differences? And not just from you fishing, but even just from reading all of our insider reports and all of our members who are putting reports in the panhandle side of things in the Gulf?
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of reports in the Panhandle, and when I fished there, I believe it's called St. Joseph's Bay. It's over, it's kind of close to Pensacola, and I mean it's a lot of the same tactics that I'm using in North Carolina in terms of spots, because there are some kind of marshy little areas. There's a little bit more creek mouth type zones, but there's still a mix of grass flats and kind of large open bays. So you get a mix of both of those strategies. I don't know 100% how strong the tides are there versus, the west coast of Florida, where it's like it's very little, a couple inches, maybe every couple hours. But it seems like there is a little bit of deeper water there that you can target these fish in. And I see a lot of those trout, again, caught at these depth changes. That's something I would say is probably just even, I'm thinking of that video that if you guys haven't seen that video, you need to go check it out. It was just trout after trout after trout, Joe and Luke catching them, but it was on a depth change. And that's something that, as we talked in North Carolina, Florida, going up again to the Panhandle, and we'll touch on it again here in a minute, depth changes. It's a really big thing for these trout because, again, they ambush from below. So they need a little bit of a depth change to come up. But it seems like the same baits work there as well. I would say that's something that's probably going to carry over. There's baits that you can adjust based on where you are to target that water column where those fish are going to be a little bit better. In shallow areas, you might want to change to some lighter or more suspending type of bait. Deeper areas, you're going to need those jig heads. You're going to need those deep divers. So I would say that if you can put that bait in front of the fish effectively, based on the type of bait that you're using, it's going to hit it. Trout's a trout, regardless of wherever you live.
It's interesting. I've heard you only talk about lures so far. Do you ever use live bait or shrimp or anything for trout?
I personally don't. I don't like live bait. I feel for me it's limiting. Just in a kayak, that having to keep, and it's a headache for me too. It's a pain to have to go either catch it or go to a shop. That's not to say I haven't used it. I've caught a lot of trout with live shrimp. When I lived in the Panhandle, or I didn't live in the Panhandle. When I went to fish in the Panhandle, I used live bait a lot for trout. We'd fish them under corks near oyster bars, and that was a really effective way to catch them. It's just to me now it's limiting. I'm always going to new areas as a fishing coach. If you're an insider, you know this. I go to almost a new area every single time I go fishing to kind of demonstrate these principles and show that our system works regardless of where you live, regardless of how different the water is. I'll drive a couple hours down to South Carolina to an area I've never fished, apply these same principles using lures. And just show that it works. But if I was to use live bait, I'd be limited in trying to keep it alive on my trip down, or going and keeping up with some kind of, live well. It's just a pain to me, which is why I use lures. It helps me feel out those areas much faster, especially if I'm in a zone that I've never fished before and I've planned out several different spots. I don't know exactly how the body of water moves with the current and everything. That's a big thing, I would say, in the mid-Atlantic, that Georgia, kind of Jacksonville, Florida, all the way up to Virginia. It's very important to understand how that current moves through that marsh or the surrounding areas, because those fish kind of know the pathway and highway of those currents, because that's what's moving the bait. So until you're there, you don't necessarily know. You can take a good guess by looking at satellite maps, and we break down how to do that in the Insider Club. But I like to use lures because it allows me to bounce between those zones in case, I did make a mistake in my pre-plan, and I absolutely do sometimes. You just need to, I feel like lures are a much better way to find fish in an area that you've either never been to or aren't really familiar with.
I agree. And many of our guests have said the same thing. I know Mike Anderson, I asked him at the very end of the interview, like, what's like the one piece of advice you could give to the average weekend warrior? And he's like, get better at using artificial lures. He's like, it's like, once you do that, you have so much more control, so much more freedom. You can go out there in your lunch break. He's like, everything changes. It was interesting though, in this book, Larry talks about one chapter on live bait. So basically the whole book is about lures, just like a lot of us who are going after inshore species now, realizing how much more effective and just quicker you can be on the water in the right time and not have to rely on live bait or keeping alive, especially wade fishing or in a kayak. But he has one chapter about live bait, and the whole thing is basically dedicated to croakers, which I thought was interesting. And he was saying back in the day, like it got to the point where it was on the table to basically consider croakers illegal to use as bait, that it was too easy. And of course, the price of croakers went sky high. It's sky high right now. I know, at least here in Florida, if you have a croaker spot, like it's top secret. Like you'll kill someone if you see someone in your spot, kind of top secret. Because those things are going like $5, $6, $7, $8 a pop, depending on the weekend and what's going on. It's nuts. You buy 50 of them, you think how much bait you've bought, and some are more than that. And if some of those guys down in Jupiter, they're going after some of this big snook. Holy smokes. Like, dude, they'll pay $50 a croaker because they know it's almost a guaranteed strike, not a guaranteed catch, but if you get it down there, those monster snook will hit it. And apparently, and it makes sense with this too, the big trout especially just cannot resist a croaker down there, especially if it's weighted down a little bit. It was really interesting that he spent a whole chapter on it and talked about some of his conversations with Texas Wildlife Department about putting something in the rules that croakers would be illegal to use as bait. Crazy.
Yeah, no, they're, and I'll say this, they're a huge bait here in the Carolinas as well. I mean, it's almost to the point where some people get mad if you talk about using them because it's supposed to be a secret thing. Yeah. They're without a doubt, they're an extremely effective bait for big trout. I would not be trying to use them to catch numbers of trout. Yeah. There's no arguing that, if you give a very good, large live bait presentation, you have a very good ticket to a big trout if you can put it in the vicinity of a big trout. That's a big thing. Just having a big croaker is not going to draw one in from a mile away. You got to be in the right spot, number one, but they are definitely an extremely effective bait. And I've heard that from almost, I would say, any serious saltwater angler, from Texas to Virginia, I've heard croakers work for big gator trout really, really well. I've not personally used them, but I know a lot of people, and there's a lot of guides that I respect that I know catch big numbers of big trout with those croakers.
Yep. But all goes back to being in the right spot.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you're just sitting there with really expensive bait.
Yeah.
So let's move over now into Texas.
Yeah.
What you got? And by the way, I guess the surprise is over. That is where Wyatt is moving. That's why we saved it for last. So Wyatt will, for all you Texas insiders and any of you Texas audience members who are contemplating joining the Insider Club, we will now have a full-time coach, and we even have some part-time help there as well now. But Wyatt will be moving there here this month to Texas, and you'll start seeing insider reports on the water in Texas every single week. So I'm really stoked to see that.
Yeah, no, it's going to be amazing. And I'll give you guys a little bit of a hint. I'm going to be moving to Corpus Christi. I'm not going to say exactly where. I'm going to reserve that information for insiders when you guys see my tip videos. But yeah, and I mean, the trout there are just amazing. And that's what I'm probably most excited to go after. That's why I was excited to do this podcast. I've got the trout bug so hard right now. And I've done a lot of research on the trout fishing in Texas. And it seems like these next couple months are going to be prime time to go get onto some big trout. I'm going to be headed over to Baffin Bay, which is a very famous trout fishery. I'm going to be doing a lot of wade fishing for trout. And I would say that's probably the biggest difference that I've seen in Texas versus all of the other states. Wade fishing is such a big thing down there. In fact, I was going into these tackle shops, and the kayak and boating aisles combined were almost as big as the wading aisles. The wading aisles, the wading belts, the wading nets, everything that went into wade fishing, it was like 3 or 4 aisles. Joe, I need to send you these pictures. I mean, it was crazy, all the wade fishing gear that was there. But if you think about it, trout have very sensitive lateral lines. And in Texas, you are fishing those very shallow grass flats where there are small indentations, the canals that the boats use to run, potholes, things like that. And that shallow water, if you're moving around in a boat that's, got that fiberglass, it's going to transmit all of the bumps and bangs that you have much further than you just making small, very kind of delicate wading splashes through the water. So getting on big trout in Texas is kind of like a lifeblood thing down there. And I'm so excited to get involved with it and start wading and going after some of these big trout. But it seems like their tackle is very, very similar to what we use, with the exception of there's a lot more suspending baits that are used. And the reason for that, I believe, is we've talked a lot about how these trout hunt, and they're sitting on these big grass flats. They have created the corkies and the fat boys down there, and it's an effective lure for covering the middle of the water column, right above those grass flats. Topwater is another effective lure down there. In fact, one of our insiders, Captain Chris Bush, Speckled Truth, if you guys know who that is, he fishes down in Texas a lot, and I was listening to him talk the other day. Topwaters, he tracks all of the really big trout that are caught throughout the year in his Dirty 30 program and the citation trout he does. And he said it was some crazy statistic. It was a vast majority of those very large trout were caught on topwaters. That was, and consistently the head-in topwaters. That was the specific lure that he mentioned. But it seems like, again, when we look at the tackle, we are targeting that middle and top range of the water column. And, I know paddle tails work down there very well, because as I've kind of studied Texas, I've gone through our insider community and I've looked at all of the reports and all of the dissections that we've put together. We actually had a full-time guide, Nathan Fox, I believe is his name, come on and actually give an awesome regional segment on how to fish in South Texas. And I watched that and I was just blown away at the similarities, but also the small, subtle differences. And it's just, you're fishing those same type of depth changes. You're looking for structure, areas where that bait is going to be funneling, and you're basically just adjusting things slightly to get on these fish. But it was crazy how much I learned just from going through the insider community, looking at reports, looking at these regional guides that we've started to put together, and just kind of filtering even the reports by month to see where the fish were moving throughout the year. If you've used our map feature, if you're an insider, you know that you can sort through the different seasons. And I mean, I've started writing out a calendar of what fish I'm going to be targeting when and where. So I feel so much more prepared going down to Texas than I would believe somebody that was not an insider would be. But that's not necessarily just because I'm a fishing coach. It's because I have access to all this data. And I believe having information is what makes someone a good angler, because they can reference the past trends, what works when and where. And that's what I believe makes you a really good angler. If you think about these guides, they didn't start their first day just because they had a talent catching fish. They learned the bodies of water that they were fishing. They learned what the fish liked under specific conditions. And that's what made them a good guide, because they have to put that rod in somebody else's hand that doesn't have that natural talent. Now, what the Insider Club has is all that data that they've learned themselves. And basically you can summarize it with all the amazing tools we've put together very quickly. So I'm very excited to get down to Texas and start putting these systems to use there and show you guys some really fun on the water reports.
Yeah, I'm pumped, dude. And that was another big piece of this book. And I kicked it off with a quote is surrounding yourself with a network, always learning from others. And that is why we created the Salt Strong Insider Club. It's everything that we wished was around when we were kind of struggling and we got our first jobs and realized that, oh man, I can't just go fish for 8 hours anymore. I got like duties, and now, wife duties and kid duties and all these things that come up in just life in general. And we're like, I wish there was just something that existed where you had a network of people and it was online and it was quick and you could get information, you could share information with, the click of a button, and have all the resources in terms of our mastery courses. And now Luke doing this weekly game plan. We did a survey recently to our insiders, which is approaching almost 20,000 members now. We asked them what were the things they liked best. And that was up there as one of the number one things, which is the weekly game plan. So Luke goes to the community. He'll spend an entire day just reading every single post, going and looking, starting in Texas, kind of like we've done in reverse, going through the Gulf, Florida, all the way up to Virginia and even New Jersey now. And basically just curating everything that's happening in 10 minutes or less. And we do it every Friday morning, so that if you are fishing on the weekend, you will have a massive advantage over the angler who's not an insider member, who's just kind of going out there and winging it with just a couple spots that they hope might have some fish. So you will have a massive advantage over the fish. You'll have a massive advantage over your friends. You have a massive advantage over the guy or the gal who's just shows up at the ramp, praying and hoping, because that's what we want to arm you with, right? Is the ability to think, all right, where's the bait going to be during this time of year, this tide cycle, all the different variables, the wind direction. That's something that we put a lot of emphasis on that most people don't even consider. The wind is critical, sometimes even more critical than what the tide's doing that day. And then tie it all in together to show you the types of spots and even the depths that you should be fishing to go out there and maximize your trip. I want to, do you have anything else on that? Because I want to read this. One of these chapters was talking about super specks, surefire strategies for trophy trout. And I thought it was awesome. I'm going to summarize it, but anything else to add there?
No, unfortunately, I don't have too much of an insight on Texas, just because I have not actually ever fished there. So, these upcoming reports, you're really going to get to see what the Salt Strong system can do. But no, I've not personally fished there. I've just got a lot of research from the insider community that I've been going through. But yeah, super specs, that's what they got down there in Texas. So what do you got there, Joe?
Yeah, as you said, our fellow insider Chris Bush will, he does his reports every so often in the community, and that dude catches super specs. So it's funny. The kickoff, I'm not making this stuff up. Angling may be said to be so. Wait, this is getting old now. I can't even read stuff. Angling may be said to be so like the mathematics that it can never be fully learnt. Isaac Walton, meaning once again, keep studying and surrounding yourself with help. So what he did is he has a network, obviously Larry does, of some of the top guides in Texas. And he interviewed them and gave them the following scenario. It's mid to late March, so this will be good for all of you anglers coming up here once the winter is kind of coming to an end. A cold front passed through 3 days ago, and the weather and water have since settled down. Winds are light out of the southeast. The water is almost as clear as the sky. The tide is moving, and the sun-warmed shallows are drawing in pods of mullet like kids to cotton candy. Giving these conditions, what is your formula for a trophy trout, a gator trout? So number one, and he says this applies everywhere, is the sunrise sunset rule. Go early or go late. He says it's a widely held opinion, now some science-based proof on this, that trout are primarily nocturnal feeders. So this one should not come as a big surprise. And he is saying early morning action is generally best on either side of the new moon. After dark, fishing shines brightest close to a full moon. And I know Chris Bush had some similar stats in terms of the time of day, and a lot of them were caught in that twilight hours, if you will, in the morning, and even some of these big boys waiting at night. The bay bottom shuffle rule, which is wait fish. You don't get out of the water to catch a trophy speckled trout. You get in it. And I think Chris would recommend this as well, based on all his stats, that the majority of those 30+ inch trout were caught wade fishing. Many times you'll see someone next to a boat, but guess what? They're in the water sometimes up to their chest. Normally they're taking the boat to this spot and then getting out. And that's why the majority of this book is tied in with wade fishing. What do you think so far?
I mean, this is all completely in line with everything that I've been researching and all of the Texas guides and books that I've been reading and studying up on. It's just, I would have to agree with the weighting. It just seems like when those fish get to that size, I mean, you think about their lateral line, it just gets bigger. Mathematics wise, they would be able to sense more. Yep. So I would definitely agree with that. And I, in just talking to other anglers, it seems like the smaller crafts, and when, anglers are anchored up, not moving, running the trolling motor, things like that, banging around, bigger trout get caught. They're not scared off as easily. Those fish get to that size because of, number one, superior genetics, but they're smart. They know when something's off, and waiting is probably the best way to not spook those fish.
Yep. Cool. Next one. This one says is 100% unanimous for Texas guys. And this is also, remember, a certain scenario here, mid to late March. And it's called the skinny water rule. Fish shallow. Shallow water naturally warms up first and fastest. Mullet and other small bait fish move in and are soon followed by oversized but somewhat lazy speckled trout. The trout's favorite meal usually concentrates in the shallows and is accordingly much easier for the lethargic early spring whoppers to capture. So that was interesting. Yeah, given those factors, the larger trout tend to expend as little energy as possible. And he makes it very clear, like he has a whole part of this book, that if you want to go catch a bunch of trout, just use small stuff. Like a lot of these small trout are just feeding on shrimp or whatever's coming their way. He's like, these big ones, which is going to be one of the next rules, they're looking for monster mullet. Like in a perfect world, it's either a big old croaker or a big mullet. They want big baits. They don't want to have to go chase down a bunch of small shrimp all day long, like the small trout. They want something big. The cliffhang rule, because I know we got to cut it short here. The cliffhang rule: fish near a drop off. You've mentioned this quite a few times. During late winter and early spring, the weather is anything but predictable. Game fish are instinctively aware of this fact. Therefore, they hold close to escape routes as long as the threat of a freeze can even remotely exist. If you want a big trout, do the same. Work a very shallow area that's adjacent to a drop-off. I thought that was a cool one. Couple more here, my friend Wyatt. The reading sign rule: look for signals, not fish. This is really important, right? And we're talking about basically the 3 B's here. You're looking for birds. You're looking for bait, little ripples, oil slicks, even sometimes tails in super shallow water, and depending on where you are. But he says that's one of the biggest thing is to read the water. The floater rule: throw topwater lures in general, which is Chris backs this up, if you want to go catch the really, really big trout, big fish, big bait. This is an interesting one. The color rule, and this is only for topwater lures. He says fish topwater lures with black backs. Ever heard of that?
Yes, I have. And it just I've thought about this one as well, and I've got my own opinions, but that I would agree that in low light conditions, I do like those darker backed lures because they're just creating a much better silhouette. I mean, trout hunt, their eyes are literally on the top of their head. They're always hunting, looking up. And everyone that's ever fished topwater lures and has missed a strike knows exactly how painful it is. And what happened was that fish didn't zero in on your topwater as well. And I've found that, my top waters that don't have dark backs, or I've had some opaque and clear ones, those fish tend to miss those. It seems like a little bit more. They can't zero in on them as well. But you got to remember that sun is shining down on top of that water, and those fish are just looking up and they're seeing a shadow. So it, for me, is really important when that bait rolls to the side as you're working that top water, that it continues to have that silhouette. So if you have any kind of pattern on the back that breaks it up, or it's just something that's going to almost reflect light, that fish, it's gonna lose that bait in the light of the surface, and it's not going to easily zero in on it, and it's not going to get a good strike on it. Nothing is more painful than watching something really big come up and take a swipe at your top water and miss it. And you just got to keep working it too. That's another big thing. And this was the same scenario that happened with me and Luke, that trout that came up and hit me on that grass flat in Florida, it hit my top water 3 or 4 times. And this is the same thing in North Carolina as well. If you have, and it's almost always with trout, redfish will only hit once or twice. Trout will hit a top water 4 and 5 times. You have to keep working it. Constant speed, twitch, 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 twitch. Even if you get hit, don't stop that lure, because those trout, they're going to continue on that path of motion. They've got those short bursts of speed, and they're going to take a swipe, re-zero in on that lure where they expect it to be, and they're going to take another short burst at it. So if you stop that lure, those fish aren't prepared to zero in on something that's behind them, because they're continuously moving, chasing down that bait. And I can't agree with this more. There's no better lure, I think, for big trout than topwater. It just elicits such an aggressive response from these fish. They feed from below, and they basically got this bait pinned against the surface. There's nowhere else for it to go. If there's something that's in the middle of the column, the trout misses a strike, it can go left, it can go right, and go up, down. Topwater, there's not a lot of places for that bait to go. So trout see that as an easy meal to ambush. And I would say that all of my big trout have come off of topwater. I've caught a couple on subsurface. I've definitely caught more trout on subsurface lures, paddle tails, things like that. Yep. But most of my big trout have come off of my topwater, specifically the Head and Super Spook Jr. and the Rapala Skitter Walk. Those are my 2 favorites right there.
Love it. And the next one is called the Topwater Tortoise. This is a rule, and it's slow it down, then slow it down some more. The good habits rule, I'm going to go through these quickly. Establish a pattern and repeat it, right? That's one of the keys to it, which is why we're always studying. I mean, we look at stuff almost like game film, right? If we see that, hey, almost 90% of all the strikes happen on the drop when we paused, maybe we should do that more often. The missed strike rule is what you kind of mentioned. If you do have a missed strike, which happens to all of us, cast there again. Usually that fish, in some cases, it might still be waiting there for this thing to go by. Always keep casting if you miss them. And then the game plan rule, stick with it. Lots of fishermen say they want to catch a trophy speckled trout. Very few, however, are willing to stick with it. Have a game plan, do some studying, join an online fishing club like ours if you haven't already. We've got some really, really big things in place for our insider members. Not only do we introduce discounts, now we have tackle discounts, and we got some new rods coming in. We have tons of new reels coming in. Tons of different lures, even some new chum and all kinds of cool stuff happening. And some of this will only be available to Insider members, including our new shrimp coming up. So make sure to come join us at saltstrong.com. You'll see a link up there to a join, completely risk-free for a whole year, unheard of guarantee. So Wyatt, man, I appreciate it. I know we got to jump on another little call here for some of our members. But this was a good one. I'm really stoked to see you move into Texas and kind of doing this Texas challenge. We've had a lot of members. If you guys don't know, Florida is where I would say the majority of our members are in terms of all the states, and then Texas is number 2, and then the Carolinas in general is number 3, and then Georgia, and then I think it's Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Virginia, New Jersey, kind of somewhere in that order, but Texas number 2. And so we had so many members saying, hey, like, we want to have a full-time coach here. And now we have it. So I'm really pumped to see, and we're going to document everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, just kind of all the lessons learned about going to a brand new state and fishing it, all over the place, not just one area. So it's going to be good.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited. And for all of our insiders listening, shoot me a message in the insider community, comment on anything that I post. Let me know what you want to see. I'm creating content for you guys. Any questions you have, let me know, and I'll go out there and film it for you. And for anybody that's got a question about joining the insider community or wants to know what we offer, I would say just take us up on it. And like Joe said, risk free. You can see what we offer, and I can guarantee you it's going to help you become a better fisherman.
Oh, yes. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for all the love, all the support. We will talk to you on the next episode. Peace. We out.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul.